Does the fact that you had sex with somebody before mean that you gave permission this time and the next time? Find out here.
Few things are as powerful.
Trigger warning, sexual abuse will be talked about in this video. Just be prepared. It's good information, but be prepared. More often than not, sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody that the victim knows. Sometimes it's a relative, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a significant other. Yes, that is possible. It comes by lots of different names. Sometimes people call it marital rape or spousal rape or intimate partner sexual violence. It can just be considered domestic violence too. It's a part of that, which is why it's a part of this 4-video series. So what is it? Let's go through some definitions. Sexual abuse is unwanted sexual activity with perpetrators using force, making threats, or taking advantage of somebody who is not capable of giving consent or who didn't give consent. Sexual abuse is sexual contact or behavior that occurs without your explicit consent. The FBI defines rape as penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or the anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of a victim. So rape is forcing you to do something that you don't want to do. This might mean having sex when you don't want to, and maybe you say no. But a lot of times in abusive relationships, you don't really feel like you have the option to say no, right? Like, you're afraid to say no. If you actually would express that, it wouldn't go over well. So that still counts. It might mean him touching you forcibly or in ways or situations that make you feel uncomfortable. It could mean forcing you to have sex with other people against your will, or to participate in role play that you don't want to. No matter what term you use to define it, or what type of relationship that you're in, it's never okay to engage in sexual activity without somebody's consent. So what is consent? You'll notice that in all 3 of those definitions that I gave you, consent is necessary. Otherwise, it's sexual abuse. So consent is agreement by both people to engage in a sexual activity. And in order legally for somebody to consent, at least in the United States, they have to be not under the influence of alcohol, not under the influence of drugs, not a minor, and not mentally handicapped, bare minimum. Any of those things in place means that they can't give consent. Even if they give consent in a court of law, it will not hold up. Furthermore, consent doesn't have to be verbal. When I was younger and I was experiencing sexual abuse, I didn't feel like people were going to believe me because it was very much a culture of, did you say no and how loudly? Did you yell no? Did you scream so that people could hear you? But that's not legally, that's not the precedent that's there anymore. Now, does that mean that it's actually held up in a court of law? You know, that's arguable at best. But legally, by definition standards, you can say no by pushing them away. You can say no by turning your head when somebody tries to kiss you. Physical stuff can say no also. And consent should happen every time, you know, with every activity. And people will mock that, and that's fine because that's okay. But like, if you're in the middle of having sex and somebody wants to go harder or more excitedly, you know, then if they're respectful, they're saying, is this okay? Does this feel okay? Are you okay? Is this okay? That's asking for consent. Because you can kiss somebody, and that doesn't mean that you gave consent for them to take your clothes off. You can make out with somebody, and that doesn't mean that you've given consent to have sex, even though socially, culturally, that's definitely there. But legally, that is not consent. What you wear is not consent. What location you're in is not consent. You can be in somebody's bed, laying on their bed, and that doesn't mean you're gonna have sex with them. You have the right to stop and say, no, I changed my mind in the middle of it. If that's what is okay with you, then you have that right. Now, in that same regard, physiological responses, body responses, they don't count as consent either. One of the biggest arguments that I have ever heard for the idea that guys can't be sexually abused is that they get hard-ons When their penis is stimulated, it's a natural physical response for that to happen. That does not mean that they want to have sex. If a girl gets wet, that is a natural physiological response to certain things. That does not mean that she's consenting to have sex. So you need to know that also. If you respond in certain ways, that doesn't mean that you wanted it, even though they're definitely going to say that. But that's not what that means. That just means that your body is a cause and effect mechanism in that way. And there are things that if you do, buttons that you push, so to speak, then results happen. Plain and simple. Has nothing to do with will or desire. It's just physiology. Sexual abuse doesn't care about who you are as a person, doesn't care about what you want. Abuse is never about what you want. It's always about what they want and their power and control over you. Now, if you have experienced sexual abuse, I believe this is the most common type of abuse out there. I mean, it might be tied with emotional abuse. I know emotional abuse is very common, which we're going to talk about next week. But there's so many people who have experienced sexual abuse who just don't feel comfortable talking about it. And sometimes, a lot of times probably, they've experienced it many, many times, whether it be by the same perpetrator every time or different perpetrators. Abusers have like this sixth sense. They can tell when you have been a victim of some type of abuse before and you are easy prey. You're like walking around with a scent that says, please attack me. And they will, and sometimes it'll be a jump out of the bushes and rape you kind of an attack, but a lot of times it's more cunning than that. They'll wiggle their way, worm their way into your life and get you to trust them and destroy you. That might be too dark for YouTube at this point. Anyway, if you've experienced sexual abuse, you're not alone. That's the short of the long of it. You're not alone. And there are people that are trained to talk to you. So I would encourage you to reach out. You can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline. I'll put the number on the screen. Or you can go to online.rain.org. It's RAIN with 2 N's. I'll put that on the screen also. And you can chat with somebody online there if you feel more comfortable doing that than talking on the phone. Sometimes speaking things out loud is so hard. And a text might be easier. I don't know. But don't suffer alone. You're not alone. Statistically, somebody who's involved in a domestic violence situation where there's physical abuse going on will more than likely experience sexual abuse by that same partner at some point or another. So, in case you missed the first video in this series, we're going to run through some things to look out for as far as an abuser is concerned, but I'd encourage you to go back and watch that one if you haven't already. There's 4 in total, and this is number 3. Videos, not red flags. Warning signs or red flags of an abusive partner. They attempt to cut you off from your friends and your family. They get extremely jealous or upset if you spend any amount of time away from them. They may insult you, put you down, say that you can't do anything right. Maybe they tell you that you're worthless and that no one could ever love you. If they try to prevent you from attending work or school, if they try to keep you from making decisions for yourself, if they destroy your property, if they attempt to harm your pets, if they threaten to harm your children or to take them away from you, or they might control your finances. That is what we talked about in the last video on the best way to keep people stuck in abusive relationships. That's a good one to check out too. And we're going to run through a list of effects that can happen as a result of being a victim of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can have psychological, emotional, and physical effects on a survivor. Depression is one of the most common effects on survivors of sexual abuse. Flashbacks, that's part of a larger animal of PTSD. The flashbacks will make you feel like you're in that imminent danger situation right in that moment. And you can have them in the middle of the grocery store or driving down the road or wherever. And all of a sudden you're back in this terrifying situation all over again. PTSD, the bigger animal, involves feelings of, I just almost sneezed, involves feelings of anxiety and stress and fear. They make it really difficult to adjust and to cope afterwards. Dissociation is a very common defense mechanism when somebody has been sexually abused, especially as a child, but even as an adult. You may dissociate during the event. The person is abusing you and you're just trying to check out and go somewhere else. In your mind, you're somewhere that's safe and somewhere where you're loved. That's how people cope with that. On the other hand, other people will dissociate afterwards. Maybe tea is not a good plan to drink while doing this. Some people will not remember huge portions of their childhood where they've experienced sexual abuse or other types of trauma, and their minds will just totally block out those whole sections of their lives. Or another way that dissociation shows up is spacing out in your everyday life, where you just sort of go through the motions and you're not really present. You're not really aware. You can dissociate on a healthy level by watching a movie and not paying any attention to what's going on around you because you're focused just on this one thing and nothing else really matters. But when you go to a farther level, a more dangerous level of dissociation, it can be scary. I had a friend who had experienced lots of complex trauma. She came to one time and she was soaking wet and had no idea why. Panic attacks. Panic attacks are another type of effect where you just suddenly are afraid. You are suddenly in fight or flight and you have no idea why necessarily. It can happen out of nowhere, but it's very common with people who have experienced abuse or high levels of stress. Pregnancy. Pregnancy is another one. Like I said, a lot of times sexual abuse within an intimate relationship, it's not the only form of abuse that's going on. Pregnancy can be a means of control for them. If they can get you pregnant, then they think that they have you. And then there's sleep disorders. You know, sometimes people, when they've experienced abuse of any kind, but sexual abuse in particular, they can't sleep. If they do go to sleep, then they have nightmares, or they just can't go to sleep at all. Maybe they're afraid to go to sleep because their abuse is happening when they're sleeping and they wake up to it. Other people sleep all the time, you know, and that's part of a depression symptom where they don't want to deal with life. And another effect is low self-esteem. A lot of times victims of sexual abuse blame themselves until they get into some therapy, trauma therapy in particular, and they process this abuse and they work out the fact that it was never their fault. Sexual abuse is always a crime of power and control. Always. And if we felt like we were in a position to be able to stop it, it wouldn't happen. So whether you're a child who has been sexually abused, or you're an adult, or you're a teenager, it's not your fault. Somebody's taking advantage of a situation and they're harming you, and that's wrong. The truth is, it's really easy for people to feel like abuse is a death sentence. I'm not worthy. I'm not lovable. I don't deserve to be safe. But that is not true, okay? It's not true. From somebody who has been through abuse after abuse, it's not true. It's not a death sentence. There are good things to come. There is a bright future for you. You just need to get help, because I don't think that this is something that you can do on your own. I don't think that sexual abuse is a hurdle that most anybody can do on their own. But you can get through it. Get yourself a good trauma counselor, or look up something online if nothing else. It's not an easy road, but it is definitely something you can do. I believe in you. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of safety. Little by little, you can take your life back. It starts with taking a step. If you're being sexually abused, talk to somebody. Call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE, HOPE, or 1-800-656-4673, or chat online at online.rain.org to figure out what your next steps will be. Thanks for watching. Until I see you again, stay safe.